Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second segment in this half hour. And we're going to be doing two more segments with Congressman Tom McClintock and probably play that out tomorrow. Of course, it'll be on the internet for everybody to see whenever you want it. Yeah. Okay, Tom, we were talking about basically, in one way, the president's knack at being able to get away with, I was talking about, you didn't bring it up, but the president's knack of being able to get away with of not ruining a lot of programs that he's in charge of. And but it seems like he doesn't govern. We don't see him governing, but we see him campaigning all the time, and his position in campaigning seems to be, well, I'm going to save everybody from those mean old Republicans who keep bringing up Medicare and Social Security, all the entitlement programs that you all so need. And I won't let them wreck that. But if we don't do something, who's going to be there?
Yeah. Well, obviously the proof is going to be in the pudding, as they say. You know, either.
Well, that's one pudding we don't want to eat.
But my point is this. I mean, and you can see this in the State of the Union address a few weeks ago.
Okay.
What policies has he delivered? Much higher taxes, much heavier regulatory burdens on commerce. Huge, unprecedented increase in the national debt, and huge increases in federal spending, unprecedented peacetime increases in federal spending. What have these policies actually produced? Family income is now lower than it was when he took office. The unemployment rate is higher than when he took office. In fact, it would be much higher except for the millions of Americans who've simply given up working. So if higher taxes, heavier regulations, more federal spending, huge deficits are the path to prosperity, we ought to be in the golden age of the American economy now. And clearly we are not. These policies are not working. And simply doubling down on a bad policy doesn't make it any better. And yet that is what the president has laid out for the next 4 years. So I think over those 4 years, the American people are going to get a college-level course in Obamonomics. And at the end of that 4-year course, they're going to be a lot sadder and a lot wiser.
Okay, let's get back to the sequester. And I think, as you are bringing up, that is probably the only way that we can do any cutting, get any cuts. And
again, not actually cutting, simply reducing the growth of federal spending.
In fact, the
Wall Street Journal had a great article today on all of these dire predictions. They're talking about $85 billion of reductions in the growth of government, $85 billion, which according to the president means the end of Western civilization as we know it. And yet, he just raised taxes $160 billion and says, that's not a problem. That's going to be just fine. Now, we take $160 billion out of a lot of small businesses. About 860,000 small businesses will be impacted by this tax. It's about 76% of all net small business income. And remember, we depend upon small businesses to create 2/3 of the new jobs in our society. We've just had those massive tax increases, but don't worry about that. That's not going to be a problem. But cutting $85 billion out of the growth of government, that's going to be catastrophic. Now, there's something wrong with that analysis.
Even when we stop and think that we're running a budget, I believe about $3.2, $3.6 trillion a year, and 84 billion. It's a very, very small number, compared to that number.
Well, I mean, think of it this way. Suppose you had a family that was earning $26,000 a year, but it was spending $36,000 a year, and it had managed to run up a credit card debt of $160,000. We know that's a family that is in serious financial difficulty. What I've just described proportionally is where our federal government is today. Now, the first thing that a family is going to do when it finally reaches the end of its rope and sits down with a financial counselor, that counselor is going to say, the first thing we've got to do is sit down and draw up a budget for you. Now, it's a difficult process. It means saying no to a lot of stuff you want. It means prioritizing carefully. It means a lot of very tough decisions, but it is absolutely essential to that family if it's going to get its budget under control.
Right.
Well, the same thing's true of the federal government, and that's why it's such a tragedy that for nearly 4 years now, the U.S. Senate has absolutely failed to even adopt a budget of any kind.
Right.
And the budgets the president has proposed have been chronically unbalanced and, in fact, projecting into the future, never balanced. The House, though, over these past 2 years has presented budgets that would gradually put our country back on the road to fiscal solvency. These are hardly draconian cuts in spending, by the way. It takes about 20 years to actually balance the budget, and then it takes about another 20 after that to actually pay off the entire national debt. But at least there are plans out there to do that. The problem is they require the consent of the Senate, and the Senate has failed to do so, and they require the cooperation of the president. And this president, right, far from bringing our deficit under control, has turned in absolutely record deficits. Right. I gave a speech to the Navy League the other day. The point I made was this: 3 years ago, Admiral Mullen warned us that the greatest right security threat to our country is the national debt. Now, that was 3 years ago. In those 3 years, we have added more to the national debt than our country had borrowed from in the first 200 years of its history. That's how much farther down that road we've gone in just 3 years.
Right. I thought during when you were speaking about that, it reminds me of process. And of course, if the Senate doesn't come up with a budget, to pass a budget, then and you do, but I mean, it will never get in the process to where they get reconciled.
Correct.
So in a way, that's a way to make sure that we don't have a budget.
Well, at least there is a plan presented by one house. Now, again, it's not binding as a budget because right, the Senate's refused to act. But there is a plan, there is a blueprint for how to get our country out of the mess that it's in and save us from the convulsions that are now destroying Greece.
Right.
I think the House needs to be much more aggressive in essentially saying, look, this is the plan we are going to appropriate under. That's why I've been urging that the debt limit, instead of being abolished for 4 months, as it was by legislation several weeks ago, instead we ought to be allowing increases in the national debt only enough to fund the government for the next 2 months at the House budget levels, which sets a trajectory to bring our country back into solvency. If we did that, we could then monitor the progress of getting the budget back under control. And by the way, the reforms that would be necessary to stay within that trajectory, if we were doing it in 2-month increments, would not be draconian. They'd be very modest reforms. But the point is, we'd be doing them every 2 months. But unfortunately, I've not prevailed in making that case to the House, and I'll keep trying.
I know it seems to be we could go there. Maybe we'll go there in the other part, or something, or maybe it would be a good place to go. The House is, we don't want to say it's divided, but the GOP is facing, or not facing, it is into, from where I sit, let me put it like this. Seems like there's a battle going on.
There is.
Okay.
And the House has not done its job. I point out to folks, the same voters who elected Barack Obama in 2012 also elected the second largest House majority since World War II.
Right.
Why did they do that? Well, the House is where all spending bills start. I believe that they are speaking very clearly that they want spending brought back under control. Yet in the first month of this year, the House has approved legislation to increase federal spending by $300 billion. That was the so-called fiscal cliff deal, $300 billion of new spending. And then the Hurricane Sandy relief was another $50 billion. And by the way, more than 90% of that had nothing to do with emergency relief for storm victims. It had to do with road repairs in American Samoa, which isn't even in the same ocean as Hurricane Sandy. So we're now more than a third of $1 trillion further down the road to bankruptcy than we were at the beginning of this year. That's a problem, and ultimately all spending bills begin in the House. The buck literally starts with the House of Representatives, and I think the Republicans have got to do a much, much better job at being worthy of the trust that the American people have given them.
Okay. When I was younger, when it seemed like when the American people would do that, basically the press and people would say, well, you know, they've got that, but they must have the other, voted for the other side to kind of keep them in check, keep them in balance, and hold their feet to the fire, whatever. But it seems like we don't hear that sort of thing. In other words, we basically hear, oh well, the American people gave you divided government, but they don't want divided government. They want you all to like compromise, do all this stuff together. And
our government reflects our country. Our government is currently divided because our country is currently divided. There is a great debate over two very different visions of the future going on among the American people. One is the vision of the American founders, a limited government that protects our individual freedom as Americans and otherwise leaves us alone to pursue our own ambitions. The other is a very meddlesome vision in which the purpose of government is not to protect our liberties. The purpose of government is to reorder society in whatever manner those in power believe it should be reordered. Those are incompatible philosophies, and we're having a historic discussion among the American people right now over which direction this nation will take for the next generation or two. And while we do that, our government is also going to be divided, but that doesn't mean that we are condemned to gridlock. We have a process that is brilliantly designed and has evolved over many centuries to resolve differences. Problem is that process is not being used as it was designed. Instead of the House and the Senate acting independently on behalf as representatives of all the people, we instead have the legislative leaders going behind closed doors with the president and working out a deal. The system's not designed to operate that way. Bad process ultimately makes bad policy, and I'm afraid that's another one of the failings in the system at the moment. And it's not a failing of design, it is a failing of implementation.
It almost seems like it's a failure in the sense of the checks and balances, but it might be that right now we have like different parts of the government working in concert with each other to disregard or not hold the Constitution
Well, that's it exactly.
as to what it says and apply it.
Yes, precisely right.
We've got to run. And so it was good. We got to talk a little bit about the philosophy, too, and you're great at that. So tomorrow, there's going to be more on TSPN because we're going to be taping another segment right after this. So stay with us here on TSPN. There's more coming up, and tomorrow in the news we'll be talking part 3 with Congressman Tom McClintock.